Welcome to Contemporary Issues Affecting Africa. Today we'll be discussing Model 5, Emerging Issues in African Development. My name is Professor Richard Boate and I'll be your facilitator. Our focus will be on issues confronting African development. One of it is going to be food security, climate change, and global and African terrorism. We'll try to explore some of the pragmatic solutions that have been discussed globally and by Africans to address some of these emerging challenges. So let's get to food security. That's going to be our Model 1. For food security, I'll try to explain the current state of food security in Africa and factors that drive food insecurity problems. We'll also discuss climate change in the topic 2, where we'll try to understand what climate change is, what is weather, and what is climate change, and what is its impact on the African vulnerable groups or vulnerable groups in Africa. Then we'll round it up by discussing global and African terrorism. What is the impact of terrorism on regional stability? We'll also look at the Global Peace Index, an index that ranks the countries according to the level of peace in these countries. I'm hoping that we'll have a very interesting time discussing these issues that are confronting Africa. So in topic 1, we'll try to understand food security. So what is food security? There are two words that have been here, security and food. What do you understand by security? So if you understand security as a state of being secure, then food security is a state in which food is secure. But what really goes into it? One definition that has been put around across the world is that food security is a situation that exists when all people at all times have physical and socio-economic access to sufficient, 1, safe, 2, nutritious food. That means the food should be sufficient, safe, and nutritious access. And that food meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active, healthy life. So within food security, somebody can mention that there is the access to the food, there is the availability of the food, and then there is the usage of the food or the consumption of food to meet our dietary food preferences. Now, what is food? There are some questions that may be coming up in your mind. In your view, I want to ask a question. What do you think? I'm giving you a definition of food security. Well, would you want to write down in a piece of paper what you think food security is? Maybe your definition may be more concerning just the access or just the usage. Or when you have your meal every morning, you think, because I'm eating enough food for this morning, it means that the food is secure. Is that what you are thinking the food security is? And even you are thinking that what factors drive food security globally? And how can food security be addressed? How do we ensure that we don't have insecurity when it comes to food? So let's get into it. There are 3 pillars of food security according to WHO. WHO is the World Health Organization. And they say the first thing has to do with food access, availability, and use, which was the pillars that are for food security, or the pillars of food security. And it actually links up with the definition that we had in the previous slide. Now, the first thing is food access. What is access? Access has to be the transportation of food, equitable distribution of food, marketing of food so that it reaches the people that are in need of them, or to reaches everybody around the world, affordability of food and the purchasing power of food. Sometimes food can be accessible, but it's not always that everybody has the means to be able to purchase the food or have the means of being able to acquire a nutritious diet. So even the food is accessible or accessible in terms of it being in a particular place where you can purchase it, if you don't have the money, or people are not earning enough to be able to purchase it, it can spare up a situation where we have food insecurity. Now think about the wars that goes around the world. Whenever there is a war in a particular town or a particular city, the access to food can be threatened. And even after war, economic lives of people may be threatened. So even if their food becomes accessible or available to them, they may not be able to purchase it. So the access is then become limited. Only those who can purchase can be able to have it. Now, what if we have farms in places that at the end of the day, if you are supposed to transport food from one place where it is harvested to another place, we have poor roads or poor road network and in such a way that whenever we are transporting the food don't get there on time. Or even because you are transporting it and it travels a long journey, by the time it gets there, the food are in a bad condition. Take an example, tomatoes. And you've got fresh tomatoes. If you don't have the right conditions of storage whilst you're transporting them, and you're taking them over quite a number of miles, by the time it gets to that locality, so for them to use it, the food may be in a condition that it cannot be consumed. So at the end, and in such a scenario, it can spare up, or in such a scenario, you can have a state of insecurity. It means that people are not having access, or you have limited access to good food or appropriate food that will be sufficient for their nutritious diet. So transportation is important. Even after transportation has been done, equitable distribution, so that within a particular locality or between a particular country, every particular region or province of that country is having equal access to food that can contribute to a nutritious diet. Affordability. I mentioned about it earlier. If people have not got the economic means of purchasing the food, what they have may able to enable them to only purchase only certain types of food that may not give them a balanced diet or a nutritious diet. So you may realize that somebody can only afford buying rice. So you may not have access to other protein foods which may come from meat or other foods that may other nutritious food that may be in the form of vegetables. So if you cannot afford to buy vegetables, cannot afford to buy meat, what he end up realizing is that he's eating only rice, and that is full of just carbohydrates, and that may not be a nutritious diet for that person, and you actually spares up a state of insecurity, food insecurity for that particular individual. Then you also have availability. It means that the food that's being produced should be made available on time for the people who are going, and in sufficient quantities on a consistent basis for the people who are going to consume it. It also means that the factors of production, that in terms of availability of water and soil management, so that you can grow the food in its right quantities, and then it can be made available to others, is also an issue that we should look into. Then we also have trade and stockpiling. It comes to the point where sometimes people who are producing the food are on the bad side of the exchange in terms of monetary exchange on getting the food. So they are producing the food at maybe X number of dollars, and they are being able to sell it, but they are not making they're not making that much. So what affects that? It affects the ability for them to produce the food at a cost that can make them be able to manage the production process. So if it is not, the trading of the food is also threatened, where a person produces, he cannot sell, or he produces but he's being forced to sell at a rate in which he's not able to make his returns, it will affect the future production of food. Then if it also produces and he doesn't have the right mechanisms or silos or storage resources, so that he can be able to store the food and then be able to make them available to others at the right time, it can also contribute to a state in which food will become insecure. So trading of the food and being able to also store it and make it available after production to the right people, or to people who need it at the time that they need it, is also an issue. There are situations in which you may realize that in certain African countries, food is produced, but being able to deliver the food to others now becomes an issue. Then we also have food use. Now, food use has to do with the utilization of food. Are people getting nutritious food? And are they getting clean water that accompanies the preparation of the food so that they can produce the nutritious diet that they are looking for? So, or do people have appropriate knowledge so that they know that if they are mixed, if I have yam and if I add it to these vegetables, I can create a nutritious diet for my child? Because if for lack of knowledge, what you realize is that somebody may only feed a particular child, or may feed in a particular community, people will be only just eating particular types of food. So the food that they are getting is not nutritious for them. So the knowledge to be able to use the food appropriately, so that it actually creates a system in which the food that you're taking is balanced, it's nutritious, and it's going to provide to the care and health of the individuals there. And it's also accompanied by adequate water and sanitation so that the food is not polluted, then becomes an issue of also food security. If you want to ensure the security of food, it's not just about availability and then accessibility. It's also that people have to be empowered with the right knowledge to be able to make use of the food and provide and create balanced diets for their children or nutritious diet for their children. They should also have adequate access to water and sanitation, in good sanitation in their communities, so that the food itself doesn't become contaminated. A lot of contaminated food stems from contaminated water and poor sanitation, which will end up resulting in diseases like cholera. And this is what we don't want to continue in Africa. So if our food becomes threatened, if the water and sanitary conditions, even the food is being cooked in, is poor, and it actually has a direct effect on the nutritious value of the food that we are taking in. You think you are taking nutritious food, but it's contaminated. So the child takes it, or the mother takes it, or the father takes it, and rather falls sick, because what is eating is contaminated with other, it's coming from contaminated water, and it actually leads to other communicable diseases. Food security is not just then about just access and availability. Usage then also becomes, utilization of the food then also becomes important. Okay. Now, so I've given you an overview of the 3 pillars of food security. Now, as of now, I'll come back to my same question. What do you then think that food security is, and how is it affecting African countries? By 2050, there will be going to be 9 billion people on the planet. The challenge we are going to have is that will there be enough food for them? Now let's listen to Dr. Ivan Fraser, who did a presentation on the global food crisis and tries to answer the 3 questions I have put before. Factors that drive food insecurity, how can food security be addressed? Let's take a video from him. And in that video, I want you to make your own notes on what you learned from what he's saying concerning these 3 questions. What is food security in your view after listening to his video and also after listening to me? What factors drive food insecurity? And how can food security be addressed? And even go an extra further, try to write down what can you do in your own way within your community to be able to make sure that you can contribute to reducing the effects of food insecurity.
Hello. My name is Evan Fraser, and I work at the University of Guelph in Ontario, Canada. Mostly what I do is to try and understand one of the biggest issues facing our world over the next 50 years. How can we feed 9 billion people? To start, let's consider 2 images. The first shows us how much food you could buy for $1 on a market in the African nation of Zambia in 2008. The second shows us how much you could buy on the same market for $1 in 2009. What happened in between was skyrocketing food prices, a crisis that has thrown tens, maybe even hundreds of millions into poverty. What's more, the victims haven't suffered quietly. They've rioted, smashed markets, and toppled governments. Remember the revolutions that swept the Middle East in 2011? They all began with people in the street upset over the price of food. What's more, many of the world's top agricultural experts believe that this is just the tip of the iceberg. Unless we figure out new strategies to deal with global food security, we may be entering a new and dangerous phase of human history where food, water, and energy shortages threaten not only worse poverty, but also civic unrest and international conflict. There are a number of reasons for this alarm. The first reason is that in most years we produce only just enough food to cover our uses. In fact, in 6 of the last 11 years, we actually consumed slightly more food than we produced. And the buffer we take from one year to the next has been steadily falling. So our system already seems pretty fragile. But it's when we look into the future that things grow very dire indeed. Rising populations and our rich diets that take a lot more resources to produce than they used to are driving our demand for food up. And scientists figure we'll need 50% more food by 2050. But producing this food is going to be hard. This is because the rising demand is coming precisely at the same time as high energy prices and climate change are making food harder and more expensive to produce. But hidden in these grim statistics is a 4-part blueprint we need to follow. But since each of these strategies is extremely controversial, each requires careful analysis. The first strategy includes science and technology. Today, a major scientific hurdle is to develop technologies that will help farmers reach their potential in terms of the amount of food they produce. Some scientists figure we could easily boost production by 50% just by deploying currently available technologies. This is especially important in regions like sub-Saharan Africa, where many farmers only produce about 20% of what they could due to a lack of good quality seeds, fertilizer, and better equipment. But it's not as if we can take the seeds and equipment that seem to work on North American farms and simply give them away to African farmers. This doesn't work because African soils, cultures, and communities are totally different than in North America or Europe. So scientists must partner with farmers to develop locally appropriate solutions to local challenges. Just using science and technology won't be enough, however. And this is where the second strategy comes in. We must do a better job at distributing the food we've got. To develop this strategy, we need to consider an uncomfortable truth about today's food system. If you take all the food on the planet and divide it equally by all the people on the planet, there is plenty. About 2,700 calories per person per day and 75 grams of protein per person per day. That's more than enough. But because we feed a lot of our food to animals, or turn corn into ethanol, or simply waste vast amounts, maybe 20 to 50% of the world's food is wasted, or because the people who need the food are too poor to afford it, hunger abounds. So we need to establish ways of making sure that less food is wasted and the food we do have is better distributed. One way of doing this is through ensuring that international aid organizations have better access to food stores that can be used as short-term food aid in times of crisis. Third, if we want to avoid a hungry future, we need to make sure we keep a healthy population of farms and farmers around our cities. This means we need to support local food systems, which are important because they stand as a buffer between individual consumers and problems that might occur in global markets. Even if local food systems do not feed all of us all the time, they are a critical line of defense against hunger. Fourth, none of this will be possible without stronger regulation and proactive government policy. I was confronted with the need for better regulation while on a recent tour of a feedlot that was licensed to hold 100,000 cows. There I saw a 410,000-ton pile of manure. That's the weight of about 35,000 elephants. It was a sad reminder of the need for governments to get serious about promoting more sustainable farming. Of course, each of these four strategies has its drawbacks. Critics of technology and markets argue that new technologies inevitably seem to enrich corporations more than helping humanity or the environment. Anti-regulation voices argue that all governments ever do is tie farmers in red tape and stifle innovation. Arguments for more equitable food redistribution causes some to mutter about the effects of Big Brother, forcing us all to eat a uniform diet. But most daunting, perhaps, is the argument that with a world population poised to reach 9 billion by mid-century, there will never be a way for modern communities to feed themselves by means of local, small farms. Our cities are simply too big, our demands too great to be able to feed ourselves without relying on extremely intensive farms. But luckily, this isn't a lost cause. Take Southern Africa in 1992. That year it suffered the worst drought in 100 years. Harvest shrank by a half, food stockpiles disappeared, and 17 to 20 million people almost starved. Yet apart from in war-torn Mozambique, there was no real crisis. And the story of how Southern Africa overcame the drought is a modern parable for how to feed 9 billion humans. It was the famine that wasn't. And the reasons for this are that Africans adopted the four strategies proposed here. First, before the emergency, local plant breeding programs introduced drought-resistant varieties of the crops that small-scale farmers traditionally cultivate. This meant that people had some food to fall back on when their main crops failed. Also, famine early warning systems used up-to-date data and weather forecasts to alert officials to the problems months in advance. Meanwhile, international donors adopted proactive policies like forgiving loans. They also contributed to food storage centers close to vulnerable communities, and so food prices stayed level. As such, local production systems on which poorer communities depend bounced back quickly. The key lesson from Southern Africa in 1992 is that while all these criticisms have their points, they aren't universally applicable, and not across the entire complex landscape of the 21st century food system. To effectively tackle the challenges of feeding the future, the most sensible approach is to imagine these 4 types of solutions as components of a well-balanced investment portfolio. One that's resilient enough to weather economic storms, is still able to provide strong year-over-year returns, and is secure against fraud and theft. Think of new agricultural technologies as similar to high-octane IT stocks. They're an important part of a profitable investment strategy. But an over-reliance on them could cost you your shirt if the market turns against you. Likewise, local food systems are similar to more modest, rainy day investments. They can't be relied upon to feed everyone all the time, but they're a vital buffer between consumers and the dangerous swings of the international market. And of course, every sound portfolio includes a cash reserve in case of emergencies, hence the need for more mechanisms to store and distribute food in times of crisis. Lastly, one of the lessons of the present economic crisis is that left unregulated, financial institutions behave badly. In the same way, we need a robust legal framework to restrain agriculture from destroying the environment. The 1992 Southern African drought passed without excessive hardship, and the agricultural cycle trundled onwards. Historically, it always has. One of the few Old Testament stories to have a happy ending was the tale of Joseph and the Pharaoh's dream. The story recounts how the Pharaoh dreamt that 7 fat cows emerged from the Nile, followed by 7 thin cows who followed them and gobbled the fat ones up. The Pharaoh ended up listening to Joseph, a prisoner in his dungeons, for the correct interpretation. Joseph told him that the 7 fat cows were a good weather report, signifying 7 rich years. They would be followed by 7 dry years of no rainfall whatsoever. To save Egypt from the famine, Joseph advised the Pharaoh to tax his farms, store the grain in silos, and prepare for the rough times ahead. Pharaoh took this advice to heart, and Egypt was saved. Today, stopping the global food crisis may seem like an impossible task. The stakes could not be higher. If we don't change how the world produces and distributes its food, then the suffering and violence of the past few years will be repeated, but 1,000 times worse. But luckily today, we have climate and demographic modeling software that are far more reliable than waiting for God to send a dream to a monarch. These models are quite clear. The years 2050 to 2080 are probably not going to be as productive as the ones between 1950 and 1980. But this doesn't necessarily mean disaster. We can avoid this nightmare and replace it with a vision of a world where no one needs to starve. We have the solutions. All we need now is the will to act on them. What can you do to help? First, go to our website. There's more information about each of the 4 strategies and things you can do to make a difference locally and internationally. We'll release an in-depth video and associated campaign for each of the 4 strategies over the next year, but we need to know which you're most interested in. So go to www.feeding9billion.com and vote on your favorite topic. Then share this on Twitter and Facebook. Send it to your friends, your colleagues, your neighbors, your families, and get them to do the same. Our funding will flow if we have enough demand and votes to make the next video. Until then, thanks for watching, and good luck.
Welcome back from Dr. Ivan Fraser's video. He tried to discuss the global food crisis, and he outlined 4 key points. One was science and technology to enhance availability. The fact that we can use science to make sure, and technology to be able to ensure that our transportation, our storage, and our production of food is secured. and then it makes it also available. Then you mentioned innovation in the distribution of food to ensure equity. Using innovative approaches to make sure that food is distributed across the world in a way that it ensures equity, that people have equal access to food that leads to a nutritious diet. Then he also mentioned healthy population of farms and farmers. The fact that we should be able to support local policy and regulations, should be able to support the effective running of farms and farmers. And farmers should be resourced in such a way that by government and by other institutional stakeholders to be able to produce food at an adequate price so that they be able to make sure that they make it available for others. Then he also mentioned stronger regulation and better policy to protect local food systems. If the cost of producing food and selling on the market is far expensive than the cost of importing the food and bringing it to countries, what is going to happen is that local food systems are going to be threatened. So it is important that stronger regulation and better policies rather favor local food systems than to rather encourage more importation of food. So the importation of food policies should rather discourage importation of food and rather encourage the stronger regulations should encourage the production of food by farms and farmers. So there should be a swap in what we are, or a switch in what we are actually experiencing now in many African countries. And that actually, because if a person is importing rice, and the rice is cheaper after importation to the average consumer than the one which is made in the country or produced in the country, grown and produced in the country, then what will happen is that the local farmer will have less resources because you might not have a lot of people purchasing his produce. There is a need for stronger regulations and better policies. If it is cheaper for somebody to be able to import rice than as compared to rice being produced locally, local farms and local farmers, their livelihoods and the sustainability of those farms will be threatened. So these are the 4 key strategies that are outlined. Now, in your community, what can you do? What can you do to be able to ensure that food becomes secure or to be able to reduce the effect of food insecurity? I think one of the easiest approach to start with is about education. Educating people on the use aspect of food. Because if food is available and we are not able to combine it to be able to, in an effective or with knowledge, we don't able to combine it to be able to generate a nutritious diet for people who are going to eat them, then you are also having a state in which food becomes insecure because use is threatened. So I think I'm encouraging that use is one way that you can start with. Another approach that you can also look at is to look at access and availability. Maybe coming together to create a collective action to encourage our governments to ensure that there are better policies to protect local food systems and promote sustainability of local farms is another thing that you can consider doing. So I've mentioned 2 that you can do in your community. Policy and enforcement to protect local food systems. And number 2, I've also mentioned that educating people on food use or appropriate use of food to be able to create nutritious diets for people within the communities. This is something that I believe that you as an African can start with. If you have got any other ideas, you can share in the forum as you continue.